Just for a second, for all you regulars, I'm going to continue to say this, so you'll get tired of it. But next week, scoot in a little and up a little, okay? Thank you. Public service announcement, mostly for me. And I say that, I'll even go, I went to a comedian, and the comedian was kind of meh, but whenever you go to a comedian, and they always try to sit you in the front row, and I never want to be in the front row, mainly because I know I'll get picked on, and I'm not always, I give it back, and so I don't like doing that. So I always try to, and so I get the front row, but I was willing to take the second row because it's Thursday and nobody was there. So that's helpful for the people up front. All right. So my wife, for several years, was a director of our Clean Water Project in Haiti. And Missouri United Methodist, we had a partnership. She would go several times in person, and we helped fund giving clean water, or water filters, so that people would have clean drinking water in Haiti, which has extreme poverty. And it was such a beautiful mission experience for so many reasons. One of the times she went, a friend of ours who was working there permanently at the time talked about one of the communities that we were working with, that they were creating a micro business. They were creating a place for women to generate some income to help provide for their family. And they were using and making objects like cereal boxes they would cut up and they would make into beads that they would then make crafts with that could be sold. And they were beautiful gifts to be able to give. But there was one woman in this community whose artwork and crafts were so much better than everybody else's. They were all nice, but whenever you brought them to market, this woman's artwork would just sell first because they were just so extraordinary. And so one of the Americans asked her, you could sell your artwork for more. It's just better. Why don't you? And I loved her answer. She said, why would I think I'm worth more than my friends? Which is very counterintuitive to us as Americans, like the capitalist mindset. It's not about what we're worth, it's about the object and what it could be sold for. That's how we think. But for her, in much of the world, actually, I would argue, they experience poverty and wealth very differently than we did. So we heard that story. Later on the mission trip, Jill was coming down from one of the mountain villages. It was very remote. On our way down, was talking to a pastor that had been working there for a long time, and was talking about poverty. And the pastor used a term that she found fascinating, I found fascinating, called relational poverty. Relational poverty. And what he said was, poverty isn't about how much money you have. Poverty is when you don't have any friends or family to rely on when you're in trouble. Isn't that interesting? Poverty is about when we don't have any friends or family to rely on when we're in trouble. I wonder, as American Christians, if sometimes we overvalue our money and undervalue our relationships. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, how do you value poverty? And maybe you have a lot of money, but are you really abundant? Or maybe you're a little bit poorer than we realize. We're going to explore that today. And I want to begin with a fortune cookie. Now, I call it a fortune cookie. It's actually from the Hebrew Bible. It's the original fortune cookie. We call it the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is like a little fortune cookie type sayings put together, except they don't have numbers on the back. But they're observations about how the world works, how life works, from one of the wisest people who ever lived. The author, historically, we've said is King Solomon. The author just describes themselves as Koheleth, meaning the teacher. But it's about the teachings and how life is created and how we're created to live wisely. And I want to read one of them. Proverbs 27:10, and there's all these short ones. I'm going to read this one. Do not forsake your friend or a friend of your family, and do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes you. Better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. That's interesting. Think about it. Reread it. One of the things that I notice implied in that is that when disaster strikes. You know, whenever I hear the word disaster, I think of like the hurricanes that have been going up Florida and the East Coast, or maybe the fires that we heard about this summer in California, Canada, Colorado. Some of us think of disasters, but I want to think a little bit more broadly than just natural disaster. Maybe a nice word is difficulties, but we're all going to experience disasters. It's not an if, but a when. Sometimes it's going to be relational disasters. Sometimes it's going to be financial disasters, a job loss disaster. Some of it's going to be a health disaster, you know, that call from the doctor. There's all sorts of disasters that we live in this world. And it's not an if, but a when. And so how does the Proverbs says you have to prepare for it? Notice it's not about like, make sure you have enough money in the bank. That's how we prepare for it. In fact, I don't think that's a bad principle. In fact, I actually would argue that it's intentional to have a reserve fund. You know, we will have, I know there's beginning talks about doing a financial, whether it's financial peace or saving grace, a course about thinking about how do we manage our money in a wise way. And a part of that principle is putting some money away for a disaster. You know, whenever the refrigerator breaks or the car breaks, you have some money to be able to respond. But what if poverty isn't simply about our bank accounts? It's about our relationships, which is what Proverbs is talking about. Do you have a friend fund? And how's your balance? How's your reserve in terms of your friend fund? Because Proverbs is saying we need to be investing in significant friendships. In fact, I find it interesting. It said, when a disaster hits, it's better to go to a neighbor, somebody close who's nearby, than a family who's far away. Now, that was written especially during times before they had cars and planes and, you know, limited ability. But even still today, if disaster hits, some of us have family. We have family who live in Paris. If a disaster hits, it's going to take a little bit before we could respond or they could respond. So it's important to have friends, close friends nearby. Who are those for you, and are you investing in friends? Now, I use that word friends because all of us have different definitions of friends, right? So my friends, and I have a lot of friends, I have a very generous definition of friends. I have 1,200 friends on Facebook, some of which I've never met, but we're friends, quote, quote, right? We have friends but I do really talk about I'll talk with my friends, which is funny because I'll use friends to talk about my core friends, and then I'll talk about friends. I'll be like, oh yeah, one of my friends, and they're like, that's your friend? I'm like, yeah, everybody's a friend unless you do me wrong, and then you're a jerk. But I'm a pastor, so I can't really say that, so I'll probably still call you, yeah, they're a friend. But you have there's some of us who are generous friends people who call everybody friends. And then there's some of us who are stingy friends people. And I don't mean that negatively. You're just very protective of who you call friends. I have one of my good friends who talks about his core friends. He says, I have 5 really close core friends. In fact, early on in our friendship, we had gotten close. And we were out at an event, and he said, Mike, I think you're in my 5. And I'm like, what? And so he told me about his definition of friends, and I was honored to be in his 5. But he's very different than me. And so one of my love language is sarcasm and cynicism. And so within 10 minutes, I made kind of pretty biting joke to him and said, okay, you're out of the 5. And so we were at the Cardinals game this week, and so I said, hey, Mark, I'm using your 5 friends. And so we were talking about it, and we were talking about that concept of his definition of friends and my definition of friends. But even though I'm not in the 5, we know we're still core friends. You want to know why we didn't know that? Because I went to the Cardinals game on Thursday, which was a day game that was excruciatingly painful. We lost 6-0. And if you're going to go through disaster, you need core friends close by. You get it? You see what I'm saying? All All right, here's my point. I want us to talk about that group of like core, close, significant, meaningful friendships because they don't happen by accident. And I want you to think about how many of those people do you have in your life? How many of those significant, meaningful friendships do you have in your life? Because when disaster strikes, and it's not a when, not an if, but a when, those are critically important to help us, to carry us along in the way that God created us to live. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about an acronym, CORE. How many core friends do you have? We're going to talk each letter means something. But I know as soon as I do that, some of you are like, Pastor Mike, I got this. Like some of you here, whenever I talk about core friendships, you're like, I can name my 5, 6, 7, 8 that I can talk about anything with. I can talk and do talk about really difficult and intimate and personal things with. And we're there when hell hits, and we're there to journey along with each other. And that's great. If that's you, gold star. I'm so grateful. Maybe some of us could learn from you today. But if you begin to think like, Pastor Mike, I got this, I don't need to listen. Just remember, there's this guy we talk about here called Jesus. And Jesus taught us to love other people as much as we love ourselves. So even if this is a strength of yours, remember that there's lots of people here who maybe this isn't a strength, or maybe our friend fund is like we're getting that low notice from, we're risking bouncing a friend check, and we need to hear this as a community. So thank you for worshiping with you. Whether you hear this for your need or for somebody else's need, I think there's something that you're going to be reminded or provoked or encouraged to think about today. Is that fair? All right. So let's geek out a little bit. Core friends. First thing, how do you create those core friends? The first is just our willingness to choose to be in intentional friendships. So we use friends in lots of different ways, but what I'm really talking about is choosing to not have superficial relationships, but to have significant, meaningful relationships that don't happen by accident. They create choice. They require a choice. So Friday, we went to the Oktoberfest. We're hanging out, and I do what I like to do, is just meet people. But I started talking to a guy there, and we connected. He's texted me. I owe him text back, actually. But he was so grateful that just somebody made the choice to reach out and talk with him. And I could tell that was significant. And I learned some things about his story, about his life, that make sense. Now, some of you, it's going to take that choice because it doesn't happen by accident. Some of you think I'm weird and can strike up a conversation with anybody. But some of us, it's going to take the choice to be willing to put yourself in a circumstance where you can grow significant, meaningful relationships. Now, this is important to me, and this is important to us here at Church of the Shepherd. We believe that our purpose is to connect people with the God who desperately loves everyone so that we can grow as disciples in Christian community. Now, 2 words I want to point out in that mission. First is connect. We try to create space to connect. Do you know what we call those? Groups. Now, that's the other part, Christian community. That's the fancy way of saying groups. We want to help you connect in groups. And Pastor Ben has created all sorts of groups. You can find that if you download the app through the Google or Apple store, you can just click groups. And it's like a menu of groups that you can get connected with. And there's some during the day, there's some during the evening, there's some that are like just kind of weirdos who meet for trivia. Andrew, they may claim me, I claim them. There's some that are like social or going out to eat. There's some that are Bible studies. In fact, we're starting a new one Wednesday night to study the book of Ephesians. It'll be a great entry if you're like, I'm interested in learning more about studying the Bible. Wednesdays at 6:30. You can learn about those through the app. Some of you are like, I'm not app ready yet, Pastor Mike. We also have handouts in the lobby. Pastor Ben's in the lobby. Online, just drop us a comment, a note. We'd be happy to connect with you. But we really create space for groups to happen. But you know the one thing we can't do? We can't choose for you to sign up. Only you can do that. So Jesus tells stories about faith. He describes it in terms of farming. He says a landowner, meaning God, goes out and scatters seeds, and he describes the different ways the seeds fall. Here's the thing about planting, and some of you do gardening, you get that. You can plant, and you can water, and you could create the good soil, and you can do all the nutrients, which is probably why everything we plant dies, because I don't get all that stuff. But you can do everything. But the one thing you can't do is to water it. Well, you can water it. To allow the sun to grow. It just happens it takes some magic to make it happen. And that's what I want to offer, is we try to create the ground, the soil, where those significant, meaningful relationships grow. And it requires you to choose, and it requires a little bit of chemistry along the way. Now, I know some of you signed up from groups in the past. In fact, some of you have told me, I tried it, it didn't work. Here's what I would say. Try it again. Try a different group. Try it again. Here's why. Because I don't want you to be in a place when disaster strikes that you don't have anybody to call. And we want to be a place where we can journey and create lifelong significant core friendships together. First, it requires a choice. Second, it requires an openness. So several years ago, I had a pastor friend who lived further away, but he was going through a divorce, significant health crisis, and work problems, probably precipitated by the first two also. But there was a lot of things going on in his life, and we've always been kind of casual friends. But for a year, I would call him every single week. Some point I'd call, I'd check in. I did this for a year. And after about a year, he was at a place where the divorce was finalized. He was at a better place. His health had gotten noticeably better. He was at a good place health-wise. He had changed churches, and he was doing better. And so I began to back off on that. And instead of calling once a week for, 6 months, I called probably once a month. And then I stopped calling. And do you know what happened? Not a single phone call. Now, I don't say that like I wasn't hurt or anything else. I wanted to be open to a significant, close, meaningful friendship, to that core friendship with this person. But he wasn't, right? I could tell that by his practices. He wasn't kind of open or willing. Now, here's what I would encourage you. Part of our responsibility is to put in the work, but recognize that it has to be mutual. They need to be open, and I need to be open in order to make those close, meaningful, significant relationships, right? But you can't control their actions. And so be willing to invest yourself in what you can, and when you see like that person's not open, or if you're the person who isn't open, think about what would it take for me to be more open to those significant, meaningful friendships. In the Hebrew Scriptures, this beautiful book called Ruth. Now, Ruth tells a story of Naomi, which is funny because it's called Ruth, but it's about Naomi. Naomi experiences unimaginable disaster in her life. First, her husband dies, which some of you know is just excruciatingly painful. But then both of her sons die. And in the Hebrew culture, women didn't have independent rights. They were kind of dependent on a man who tended to provide. So that's why the Hebrew Scriptures teach us to care for the widows and orphans, because they're the most vulnerable people in this society. We continue to still today to care for vulnerable people because that's how God taught us to care and live the way God created us for. So Naomi was very vulnerable, and she had 2 young daughter-in-laws. And she turns to her daughter-in-laws and like, women, I got nothing. I literally have nothing. I can't provide for you. Please go home, go to your parents, let them take care of you. You're young, you'll have a chance to restart your life. Go back to your home country and recreate your life. Just leave me alone to die. But one of the daughter-in-laws is named Ruth, hence the name of the book. And Ruth, whenever she hears this, hear what she says. Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And I love that image because in that moment, Ruth chose and then was open for this significant, meaningful relationship that would not only change Naomi's life, but would change Ruth's life. Because of this relationship, they would then go back to Naomi's home country. They were eating the scraps from the farm they would glean, and there was this guy named Boaz who noticed them, who left a little extra on the edges so they would have enough to eat. Eventually, a friendship created, and eventually Boaz and Ruth got married, and they continued to care for Naomi. It's this beautiful image of what it looks like to have community in the middle of disaster. Now, here's my question. Who's your Naomi? Who's your Ruth? Who's the cultivating relationships so that can carry you through difficult times? You have to be willing to choose and to be open. And the third is to risk yourself. Because significant, meaningful relationships, they require us to risk and to be vulnerable and to be intimate. Now, whenever I talk about intimacy, oftentimes I'll do it in premarital counseling. Intimacy, which is what we have when we marry, requires vulnerability. Now, when I use the word intimacy, most of us think of like physical intimacy, and it requires vulnerability. Number one, you have to take your clothes off to be intimate, and that requires a lot of vulnerability. But there's also intimacy in terms, I think, much more significant in relational or emotional intimacy. And what that requires is being willing to share more and more of yourself in a way that trusts the other person to let you inside, right? That you're going to share as you become intimate things that you don't share with everybody else. And we know this. We know some people, maybe you've had this experience, where they're oversharers. Like the first time you meet, they're telling you all their details and all their personal stuff, and they're just sharing and sharing and sharing. And you're like, wow, I just was here to order a cup of coffee. Don't be that person. But also don't be the person that doesn't share anything, that's just so kind of closed off that you can't peel the layers back to begin to share. And I don't want to gender stereotype too much, but especially as Americans, men are especially struggle with this. Even the word intimacy, guys, you're like, I don't know, that feels uncomfortable. And so let me give you a different word than intimacy that might be a little bit more palatable. This comes from a different fortune cookie in the Bible called Hebrews. Proverbs 17. In the NIV, it says this: a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. You hear it? That goes back to, put it back to the other Proverbs. It's talking about when that difficulty, when that disaster, when that struggle happens, adversity happens. That's where you need brothers or sisters. And that term implies a level of intimacy, right? Our siblings know stuff about us that we don't want other people to know. My brother, the reason I fear every time he comes because he knows stories on me that I hope none of you ever find out. But here's why I don't mind him visiting, because I know enough on him that he won't tell you my stories. You got to risk yourself if you want to have significant, meaningful relationships. We got to choose, we got to be open, we got to risk. Anybody want to guess what the E is? Here it is. English people are going to love this. Intentional. Oh, online people, I got a good groan. That's awesome. I had to be creative. It takes intentionality. It takes persistence. You're going to try it with somebody and you're going to choose, you're going to be open, you're going to share yourself, and for some reason the chemistry didn't work, it didn't work. Things are going to happen. And we know from this, core friendships, they begin to change over time, right? You have some core friendships at your school right now, but you'll graduate, and you'll move off to what's next, and you lose some of those. And some of those you're going to carry with you, but some of those you don't. And so it requires intentional time after time. Some of you are going to lose friends because a couple divorces and then it messes up all the friend group relationships. Some of you, it's somebody's going to die and so you lose one of those close, intimate friendships. There's all sorts of reasons that you have to continue to invest in those. In fact, my mom taught me this. Girl Scouts, if we have any Girl Scouts know this, you have a song for this, right? the make new friends, keep the old. One is silver, the other's gold. I've never figured out which one's silver, which one's gold. The new ones or the old ones. I don't know. But they're both precious and they're both important, and they both take our persistence and intentionality and willingness to choose, open, and risk ourselves for this. Paul talked about it this way, another farming image. You reap what you sow. What you're planting now is going to grow later into a harvest. What are you planting in terms of your relationships, in terms of your friendships? One more story I want to read. I wanted to read it rather than you see it on the screen because I wanted you to hear it for a second. This comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2. At the beginning of Mark, you can go home and read it for yourself. But I want you to hear this for a second. Jesus has started his ministry, he's becoming popular. And in Mark chapter 2, it says, after a few days, Jesus went back to Capernaum. And people heard that he was home. So many gathered that there was no longer space, not even near the door. Can you imagine? So it's a small little home in this remote village in the middle of Israel, or Jerusalem, or Israel. And people are crowded around. I kind of picture like even the windows being full because Jesus is kind of a big deal at this point. Everybody's around. They're packed. And Jesus was teaching. Jesus was speaking the word to them. Now, some people arrived, and 4 of them were bringing to Jesus a man who was paralyzed. Now, you can imagine this group of friends are carrying a friend on a mat who's paralyzed, and they come to the house, and it's packed. They couldn't carry him through the crowd. So, you need this one friend who's like sees the obstacles like, hey, I got an idea. Let's go up to the roof. Because we all need that one friend, that one core friend who's willing to do whatever we need. That's this guy. So they carried him up they tore off part of the roof where Jesus was. I wonder how the homeowner felt. They tore off part of the roof, and when they had made it open, they lowered the man on the mat on which the paralyzed man was laying. Now, can you picture it? This crowded house, they tear open the roof, they lower this paralyzed man because of his friends. And here's what Jesus sees. When Jesus saw their faith. Now remember, this is a man who's paralyzed. So the plural there, whose faith are we talking about? The friends, right? That core group of friends. When Jesus saw the friends' faith, he said to the paralyzed man, child, your sins are forgiven. When Jesus saw his friend's faith, the man received healing. Isn't that a beautiful image? That God wants us to have people who come alongside us because it's not an if, but a when disaster strikes. Whether it's paralyzed, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a friend, a family, a financial, whatever it is. We need people who are just crazy enough to do what it takes to open a roof to get us in the place where God can bring us healing and wholeness. And I want to ask you, do you have those friends? I'm going to close with a word of prayer, but I'd like for you to name those people in your heart. I can thank God for those friends I have, and some of you are like, Mike, I got it. That's awesome. I want to celebrate that. I want to thank God for those friends. But if you don't have those, I'd like you to just pray silently in your heart, God, I want those type of relationships. I want those type of connections. Give me the courage to do that. And we'll see what type of miracle that God might grow in your life. Will you pray with me? God, thank you for loving us beyond what we can imagine. We know that no matter where we are, you're always with us. But we know that you didn't create us simply to love you alone, but you created us to love others, to be in community, to be connected for good times and bad, that we would experience the abundance of life that Jesus came to show us in his friend group, the disciples. God, for some of us here, as we've been talking about friends, we're thinking about specific people. We know that I am so grateful for them. I'm so grateful for those people in my life. But I also know there's some of us that maybe can name one person or 2 people, but we realize there's a gap, there's a deficiency, there's something missing. And you know that, and we know that. hear our prayer. God, work a miracle in our life. Do something sacred and holy, and give us the courage to choose and to open and risk ourselves and to be intentional, that this wouldn't be a decision on Sunday morning, but throughout the week to continue to persist and see ways that you might grow something new that we couldn't imagine, but we desperately need. God, I thank you for your grace and love, and we thank you for this community, the big community of Church of the Shepherd, but the small communities that you've given to do life with. Bless them. Bless us. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.